If you like unit grain trains, you might enjoy or even learn something from watching this video. Not only do we have a record-setting 52-car unit grain train, we also have several accidents, derailments, I guess you would call them. Here's another one. Oh. And we're going to check coupler trip pin heights to make sure we don't have a derailment from that. And we'll test the grades on the railroad and make sure our grades are acceptable. And finally, we'll end up with a pusher operation with 3 engines on the front and 1 on the rear. Oh boy, that's a nice shot. Hi, this is Burr Stewart, and I'll be your host for this video, which is part 71 in my continuing series of model railroad operations videos on this channel, which I hope you've enjoyed in the past. But today we're in for a real treat with this grain train. So let's get started. Nothing like a little gratuitous horn blowing, right? I put together this 52-car unit grain train with every single grain car that I own in N scale that I've been collecting over many years. I put them all on the railroad, and it ended up being 52 cars. So I thought, well, let's see if I can get this to run all the way around my 4x8 foot N scale layout. And as you can see here, it laps all the way around itself. If you look behind the locomotives, you can see some cars, the couplers bunching up together. These 4 engines are pulling this 52-car train up a long, slow grade in the front of the layout. Fortunately, it's a straight shot, pretty much, up to the main yard. But this is a mixture of cars. I started out modeling the BN years and then added cars that were a little bit after that. You see Wisconsin Central there. The Saskatchewan car would have been from the late 70s, early 80s. And in the inset, you can see an aerial view of the entire layout and how this train is wrapping itself around the main line. None of this would have been possible without the introduction of the Fox Valley standard with metal wheel sets, which I've installed on all 52 of these cars. And they have a very sharp flange, very similar to the original Microtrains pizza cutter wheels. But since they're metal, they have more weight to them and they hold the car down on the track. And since the flanges are so precisely thin, they do an excellent job of tracking through my 35-year-old Pico switches that are on this layout. This layout has been in existence since about 1980, and I've had nothing but trouble with derailments almost the entire 35 years until a friend of mine, Todd Von Stoop, who's an avid N-scale modeler, tipped me off to these Fox Valley wheel sets, and I'll show you a picture of them in a minute. There's something I really like about a unit grain train. I keep thinking of all of these grain elevators in the Midwest consolidating this grain and shipping it all the way to the West Coast ports like Seattle, where it gets shipped from there to all of the countries in Asia. And it's just a fascinating piece of transportation. And apparently some of you agree, because a previous video that I published, part 5, handling unit grain trains in HO scale, has had over 36,000 views in the last 3 years. I'll post a link to that video in the description below, in case you want to watch it again. The lead engines are now at the very top of the grade for the railroad. They've gone from the bottom there, where there's a hidden staging yard, and they've climbed all the way up to the top. I'm not sure what the total elevation gain is, but it looks like it's about maybe 6 inches. And you can see the tunnel there goes down to the staging yard on the other end. And of course, the train will be doing that soon. Did you notice how the sound cut out just momentarily? That happens once in a while when it comes over an interruption in the electricity. I don't know why the manufacturers couldn't put in a very small capacitor in these locomotives so that they would be able to withstand a slight amount of drop in power from the rails, but they haven't done that. So who knows? Maybe they will in the future. The scenery on this layout is your standard hydrocal over cardboard strips with zip texturing on the top with latex paint and sprinkled ground foam. After 43 years, it certainly stood the test of time. And this bridge is a Cato bridge, which you can still buy in hobby shops today. I bought it in 1979 or 80, I think, and it's been in service ever since. That yellow grain car commemorates the 2004 annual convention of the National Model Railroad Association, which was held in Seattle. Now we should see the locomotives come into play. There we go. They've come down the hill on the backside and are preparing to dive into that tunnel I showed you a minute ago and go back down to staging where they come from. So at this point, oh, that's a nice looking locomotive. A GEVO unit, I guess, with that flared radiator top like that. The three following units are ScaleTrains C44-9Ws. So we're seeing the front of the train dive into the tunnel down to the staging yard. The top level shows the rear end of the train. Very nice. Normally when you see a unit grain train, most of the cars are the same, but of course in this case I just have everything that I own. They mainly belong, but I don't think you'd normally see a grain train with this much variation in color. No, that's a nice angle. You can really see how the train is wrapped around itself, the 52 car train. And here's another angle. Now this is the second time the train has come around. And I just wanted to point out again, this is a nice, long, slow uphill climb. The reason that's relevant is because when we try to turn the train around and go the opposite direction, it's going to be a much steeper grade. And these four engines may not be able to pull 52 cars without some sort of a stringline derailment. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. Right now we just want to enjoy the amazing record-setting 52-car unit grain train. And, I want to prove to you that it actually is possible. And just for the record, I love the looks of those green BN hoppers with the large logo. Sweet. Now, as I mentioned, going the other direction, not only do we have some steep grades that will be hard, but also the minimum radius for this layout is 12-inch minimum radius, which is pretty steep by today's standards. And so the train going the opposite direction is going to have to wind up that central spiral with both steep grades and the 12-inch radius curves. So the more I ran this train in what I guess I would call the easy direction, I started thinking we really should turn it around and try it in the other direction. But there is no way that those four engines hauling 52 cars up a tight curve are not going to stringline. So I decided the first thing to do is take 12 cars off, and we can try running the train the other direction just with 40 cars instead of 52. And that gives us a chance to do some switching operations, which I always like to do. But before we do that, let me show you these wheels that I'm talking about. This is a shot of the actual product, which you can now buy from ScaleTrains on their website or in hobby shops if you can find one. And the key is they're standard wheels. They're not fine wheels or semi-scale. You don't want the thinner wheels if you're going to use these old Pico turnouts. And here's a nice shot of the overall layout from high up in the ceiling, and you can get an idea of what's going on. Now, in the back to the right is eventually going to be a grain elevator, and I have room for 12 cars on 2 tracks there. And so what we're going to do now is to switch 12 of the grain cars into the sidings there so we can get our train down to a reasonable length of 40 cars for running in the clockwise direction. Before we get to the switching, I just wanted to give you another chance to absorb how the layout is set up. This particular shot is 8 times actual speed. I just sped up the video, and you can see now the engines are going at the very top of the grade, pulling that whole train up the long hill there and into the yard, which is flat. And now the engines are heading down a very steep grade, all the way down back to the staging yard, which is down in the bottom to the left of the main yard. And then once they get the train inside the staging yard area, you can see the engines going by the staging yard, they come back out the tunnel where we first started this video. Notice the bunching of the end of the train. That's another subject. So now we're going to try setting out these 12 cars from our unit grain train, and we're going to set them out back on those 2 tracks to the left that are empty. So I flipped the switches in order to have the train go out to the back, what I call the back lead, in the back of the yard. And if you are an astute observer, you'll notice that one of the switch points in the foreground ladder is not set right. Of course, what that means is when the engine gets to it, it'll short. And this is reality model railroading on this channel, so you'll get to see what went wrong there. And in the inset, I've got the same exact situation or scene happening from the opposite end of the layout. See, there's the short. It just stopped right there. So I pushed it back to make sure those points were right, set those points, and now we're back in business. Nothing like a telephoto shot to show you how warped your track is. I always thought I did a pretty good job on that track laying, but looking at it now, I'm thinking, whoa, that's some wiggly track. It might have been better back when I built it in 1980, but all these years, maybe it deteriorated, who knows? I don't think so. Anyway, if you've been counting, we need to uncouple the first 12 cars of our train. You can see me there walking back to the back with an uncoupling pick. And we're going to uncouple right there, right before the Wisconsin Central white hopper. That's going to end up being the last car on the train after we remove these 12. Now, as you know, it's much harder to back a train than to pull it forward in terms of derailments. So this is a real test of our Fox Valley wheels. We're going to shove 12 cars into a ladder, and with any luck, they won't derail. Shove them back onto that left-hand track. Someday there will be a grain elevator against the backdrop there so that you'll understand that these 2 tracks are for grain. Right now they're just two empty tracks. They haven't even been ballasted. In fact, none of this yard has been ballasted yet after 35 years. Well, you know, I've been concentrating on the HO layout in the basement, as you know, if you've watched this channel. But one of these days we'll get it ballasted. Now, I'm doing something bad here. I'm trying to couple it at an angle, and I didn't realize that I derailed the rear truck when I did that. And the consequences of derailing the rear truck are going to be evident. Ow! Oh, can you believe that happened? Ouch. So I'm going to spare you all of the time that it took me to get these cars back on the track, and we'll go to the next segment. So we're ready to back up and set out the other 6 cars on that middle track there. I just love watching a train snake through multiple crossovers. Looks so cool. You get to see it from both directions here. On the lower left of this scene, you can see a bunch of empty wood chip cars. Those are in the staging yard down at the lower level and a general merchandise freight, which we're not going to run today, but you can look forward to that sometime in the future. Well, look at that. We're able to get out of there without another derailment. All that's left now is to flip that switch and go pick up the rest of our train, which, as you remember, is 40 cars long now. So we have 4 engines and 40 cars. And we're proceeding in the counterclockwise direction right now, as we have been. But after I pull these cars a little further out to the upper town, we're going to move these engines to the other end of the train. And then we can pull the train in a clockwise direction and test that steep hill that goes up to the 12-inch radius curve. Oops, I kicked the tripod. So keep an eye on that light gray Wisconsin Central car right next to the engines there. That's going to be the end car for our clockwise train. You'll see that happen in just a minute here. Okay, we stopped the Wisconsin Central right there on the trestle. See if we can uncouple it without derailing it. There we go. You can see it's an uphill grade, so it moved back a little bit. Isn't that impressive, the sound of those engines, considering it's so small and scale? I just love it. Now our 4 engines are going to quickly run around the loop. And you just saw me set the switches for the illegal cutoff between the loop and the long grade going up to the main yard. You can study that in the aerial shots that I have earlier in this video. Now the inset shows the engines going down that steep hill from the upper town down to the front of the layout. Now coming around the end, it's going to go through a crossover there. so that it can immediately charge up the hill to the main yard without going down to the staging yard whatsoever. By the way, I meant to comment, I hope you've been enjoying all of the tools and paraphernalia that I have in the car card boxes. It turns out to be pretty handy to have a bunch of places to store things, although it certainly is visually distracting. Ugh. In theory, I might set up car cards one day, but for now it's just been great to have a place to hold everything. Here you can see I'm coupling onto the end of the train, and we're going to take a slight pause to point out one other technical aspect of running long trains. And this is you need to really test the height of the uncoupling trip pins in these micro-engineering couplers. See how they're all well above the railhead, and that's what we want. And I went through the entire 52 car train before producing this video to make absolutely sure that there were no trip pins hanging down between the rails to cause a derailment by catching on a switch. So that's just one additional point that I wanted to make about this record-breaking 52 car train, was that I tested every single coupler trip pin. Then there's the engine, which doesn't have a trip pin in this case, although I wish it did, because the micro-trains couplers are a lot better in my experience. All right, we have the train hitched up to the 4 locomotives, and we're going to do this very scary test. We're going to take the train all the way down to the staging yard, then we're going to come out of that tunnel you see to the right of the locomotive, and we're going to slog all the way up that grade to the top town around those 12-inch radius curves. And we're going to see if it can do it without stringlining at the very top, when all of the pressure will be on the first and second couple of cars there, all of the drawbar pull. I guess this is the topic of train handling or train dynamics, and we're exploring what's the outer limit of N-scale train dynamics with an uphill grade. You can see I'm making sure the switches are set back to the mainline positions on both ends of that yard that we were just in. Now we should be clear to run through that yard. On the inset, you can see the engines coming through the staging yard in the lower level, pulling what, as you may remember, is now a 40-car train with 4 engines. Remember I said the Wisconsin Central car would be the last car on the train? Well, there it is. And here, coming up through the tunnel, is our 4 head-end units. Hopefully I flipped those 2 switches back so that they'll continue without stalling. So far so good. Now we've already climbed up from the staging yard maybe an inch or 2 of elevation gain, and we're going around the first 12-inch radius curve. Of course, most of the train is still in the staging yard at this point, so it hasn't hit the grade yet. Now as we get up to the top of the grade, we're coming around that second 12-inch radius curve, 180 degrees. And this is where the rubber meets the road, right here. And these 4 engines pull that 40-car train without stringlining. I kind of like this sunlight, so I went ahead with it. Here it is. And they do it. They cannot do it. So 40 cars is too much. Let's take another look at that Stringline just for fun, since it's a real thing. Look at that. Isn't that kind of cool, having the sunlight shine on it? The engine stopped. They're calling headquarters to figure out what to do next. And what the train master has come up with, after surveying the scene from a high altitude, is the fact that if we were to put one of those 4 engines on the rear end, we could push the rear end of the train enough that it would reduce the drawbar pull. So before we do that, let's just check on what these grades are. That was the 0.00, showing the level in the top town, which is good. This is the micromark grade meter. And you can see that the beginning of the grade downhill is a reasonable 2.1, but it quickly turns to a 2.78, almost a 3% grade. No wonder it did a Stringline. And then halfway down it moderates a little to 2.2, but that's still a pretty significant grade in terms of putting pressure on the coupler behind the engines. And then at the bottom it starts to level off for that siding at less than 1%. And then coming up from the staging yard on the other side, we have a 3% grade, which seems pretty bad, but as we move to the right of that, it tapers off. So that long straight stretch that we were doing successfully with 52 cars, 1.2% isn't too bad, continues to be reasonably moderate. And as we move to the right up that long stretch, we're still down in the low 1% range. And up near the top, it starts to be almost 2%. But by then, we've got a lot of the train on a lower grade. So now that we know what grades we're dealing with, I've taken one of the 4 locomotives and put it on the rear end of this 40-car train. And we're going to come up this steep grade and around the 12-inch radius curve one more time, only this time we have a pusher at the end of the train. And the question is that enough to relieve the pressure to allow us to get around the layout without a Stringline? You can see me concentrating really hard on where the slack is, where the coupler slack is in the train, because of the pushing action of the rear engine. We have all the same cars we had before in the front, so that shouldn't be a factor. If they're going to Stringline, they're going to Stringline. And where it happened before was right in about here. Isn't that right? This is about where the Stringline took place, and it looks like the pusher on the end of the train is just what it takes. And of course, if you've been rail fanning at all, you know that's what the real railroads do. They put a pusher locomotive on the rear of these very, very long trains that they run to relieve the drawbar pull right behind the front locomotives. Well, I'm happy about this. It seems like a successful experiment. We were able to discover that with a 40-car train, you need 4 engines, and one of them needs to be on the back in order to get up a 3% or almost 3% grade with 12-inch radius curves. Now, if you had a layout with broader curves, you wouldn't have quite the risk of this Stringline. And of course, you also don't really want to have grades as high as 3% if you can avoid it. Well, there's that Wisconsin Central on the end of the train, which means there's a pusher engine there, and there it is. You can see that pusher engine. And if we do the math, we've got 40 cars and 4 locomotives, so he must be pushing about 10 of those cars. And if we went down and looked carefully, we'd see that they would be bunched up instead of pulling. They're pushing. Someday, but not today, I'll do another experiment where I remove the train down just to 30 cars and 3 engines and see if they'll make it around this corner without stringlining, without the pusher. Here you can see the front end of our train with the 3 engines in the lower right and the rear end with the pusher engine on the upper left. Very nice. And here's another shot of the same situation after another loop around the layout with still no derailments. We have the 3 units heading across the bridge with the helper unit pushing the rear of the train up that steep curved grade. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. We've had a lot of fun trying to run the longest possible unit grain train on a 4x8 foot N-scale layout with 2 to 3% grades and 12-inch radius curves. And with a little experimentation, we succeeded, with a general principle of about 10 cars per locomotive. And with the grades and curves on this layout, a maximum number of 3 locomotives at the head end. So with that, I hope you'll watch some of the other videos on my channel. And for now, this is Burr Stewart, wishing you much fun with trains.